I just finished eating a cough drop, and it made my water feel very cold. Whew. Hello folks, welcome back to my channel. I hope you all had a wonderful, safe, refreshing new year. I'm filming this on January 1st. Please excuse my voice if it sounds a little froggy or gets a little raspy as we go along. I'm still recovering from a cold. I have some tea I have to share. I have to shout out the tea that I have been drinking because I opened it like the day I got sick and it's amazing. It's from the brand The Cat and the Kettle, which is a very small indie tea company that's based in Seattle area. You can find, they have a website. I will link the website, and they do have like some in-person, they have an in-person retailer in Everett, which is north of Seattle. So this is the tea Dionysus, which has hibiscus, cinnamon, lemon peel, orange peel, cloves, and star anise. I was a little nervous about this because I don't like, because I'm really picky about my cinnamon. If it's like a spicy cinnamon, like cinnamon chewing gum, I fucking hate that. But I do like cinnamon in like cinnamon rolls and oatmeal. So it just kind of depends on like how bitey the cinnamon is. But yeah, this is a very boldly flavored tea, which is perfect for when I'm sick and everything tastes gross. This is just like all of like the tart, bold flavors that I love. And it tastes like if you had warm apple cider, but instead of apple cider, it's like a cranberry orange. Because like if you've never had hibiscus juice, it's very, very tart, kind of like cranberry juice, but like cranberry juice and lemon juice. And then you can definitely taste the orange in there. So it's been lovely, and I just have to shout it out. So, okay. I am so behind on filming my end of the year content because I got sick immediately after Christmas. So let's get into it. Today I'm filming my December wrap-up. It was a pretty good reading month. I read 9 books. Hopefully this video won't be too long, but some of them I have very lovely, strong, good feelings about, so I might wax poetic for a long time. Alright, let's get started. So first off, the first book I finished was The Apollo Murders by Chris Hadfield. I listened to this on audiobook, which was narrated by Ray Porter. So if you recognize the name Chris Hadfield, you're like, I don't know that author. He is most well known for being an NASA astronaut. He was like the commander of the International Space Station for several years. He's written one other book that's a nonfiction about being like an astronaut in space. So this is, to date, I believe his only fiction book. It's a historical fiction. It's a historical thriller, maybe thriller, political sabotage, tense international relations, historical fiction. It does take place in space, but I wouldn't call it a sci-fi, because it takes place, I forgot exactly which year, and I don't have the physical copy because I gave this book as a gift to my my father-in-law. So hopefully he enjoys it as much as I did. It takes place in like 1979. It's like still fairly early days of sending people into space. I believe at this point the Americans have landed on the moon. Oh no! Shoot. Well, now I know how long the battery lasts in my new lights. Boo. Lights are charged. Tea is refreshed. It's almost time for dinner. So let's see how quickly I can get through these reviews. So I was starting to talk about the Apollo Murders. It's a historical fiction. It takes place height of the Cold War between U.S. and Soviet Union. At this point, they both have a space program. The Americans have put someone on the moon, but the Russians have not yet. So let's see, what's this? How? Hopefully, I can coherently describe the setup. So the Russians have a rover on the dark side of the moon. And they also have like a a surveillance satellite that the Americans don't really know much about it yet, and the Americans don't know what they're doing on the far side of the moon, but they know they have some intelligence that there's something really important about this, and the plan is to have a moon landing with 3 astronauts who are all former military men. I think, like, technically NASA is a branch of the Air Force, but there are people who, like, go straight into being an astronaut, and then there's people who, like, go through the Air Force and are a part of the military before becoming astronauts. But they want military-trained astronauts because this is going to be, like, you know, the public knowledge of this flight is moon landing and, like, gathering moon rocks in a science expedition, but its true purpose is to fly close to this Russian satellite and do some surveillance, and then also try to land close to where the rover is, and possibly disable it, because, you know, Cold War is a couple of world powers kicking each other's shins under the desk, you know? So before the launch, something happens. There's something that at the time they don't know whether or not it's sabotage. They have to replace one of the astronauts on the flight. And then when they get close to the Russian satellite, they discover that it's manned. There's a cosmonauts on it, which they weren't expecting. And things happen. Trying to be vague because there's a lot of, like, action. Excuse my orange tongue. Say it with me. I was eating spicy chips. I'm trying to not spoil the action, but also trying to give you a sense of, like, what the stakes are in the story. So things happen and they end up with one of the cosmonauts on their ship. And because of the nature of space travel, even though they don't trust each other and don't speak the same language, they kind of have to rely on each other to complete the mission and stay alive and hopefully get back to Earth in one piece. So it's very interesting anyway, so I had a really good time with it. This was a great, kind of, like, edge of your seat action ride of, oh shit, that happened. And it's a combination of, like, people misunderstanding something and then acting on that bad assumption and making a mistake and fucking things up, and now they gotta work for it. And then, like, intentional sabotage and, you know, it's a combination of, like, intentional and accidental things that lead to these very exciting plot points. So I thought that was really well done. I thought the characters were well rounded. It's very interesting. Like, you can definitely tell that this guy has been in space. There's like little bits of trivia that's like, oh yeah, who would think to research something like that? But it does add to the environment and the experience, and just, like, how, you know, no amount of, like, training on Earth can really prepare you for suspended time in 0G or working at accelerated G's when, like, the engines are thrusting. Let's see, what else? I also really liked the exploration of the limits of technology. It's a little bit like what happens in The Martian when that guy has to use, like, a very old method of communication because he doesn't have, like, his modern communicators are damaged, so he has to do, like, still images and stuff. So there's kind of that same element of a really well-researched and well-executed presentation of the limits of the technology that sent people into space. I think, I don't remember what the trivia is, but it's like, yeah, the computing power of, like, the first manned space flight had, like, less computing power than, like, a Game Boy or something like that. It's just, it was, you know, the historical fiction aspect of it, of, like, what was the technology at the time, and what was possible with it, was also very well done and very engaging. I mean, kind of the closest thing I can compare it to is The Martian. It does not have, like, the sarcasm and the humor of The Martian, but it's kind of like, okay, The Martian meets Apollo 13. Okay, next we have one of the last books. Was this the last book? Yes. We have the last book from my Amnesia Reads project. That is Georges by Alexandre Dumas. It's funny, whenever I, like, type this title, I have to type Georges Alexandre Dumas, because, like, even in, like, looking for, like, different cover art or anything, like, this is apparently not a very well-known work by Alexandre Dumas, who is the author who wrote The Three Musketeers, if you needed a little prompting of who is that. Okay, it takes place on Mauritius Island, which is an island to the east of Madagascar. I believe it's that the book opens when the title character of Georges is young, when the British have taken over the French in terms of colonizing the island. What's the word I want to use? Britain has just taken over France in terms of acquiring Mauritius. Mauritius? I'm going to say Mauritius. They've just acquired Mauritius as a colony. It was formerly a French colony, and now the English are governing it. That's the word I want, governing. So Georges is the younger son of a wealthy mulatto family. So he is a very pale, he's a very light-skinned, white-passing black man. And as a child, during this initial revolt, where initially they fought off the French and eventually the English come and retake the island, he sees his father be humiliated by a white military captain who is like, I don't want you to fight for me, like, you're not worth it, you're not, why would I let you fight for me, like, you're just a mulatto, whatever. And then there's some other things that happen where this is kind of like the formative moment in George's life where he realizes that no matter how wealthy, how educated, how attractive, how successful, he will never be seen as equal to white men. So he and his brother go off to France, to Paris, for education and, like, to escape some things. And then he comes back in his 20s, and he has this, like, lifelong goal to enact revenge on, the white men specifically who insulted him and his family, but also to kind of prove specifically to the island that he is worthy of respect from white people, and he is just as deserving of, he's just as deserving, if not better than them. So, of course, along the way, when he comes back, he meets an attractive young white woman who, of course, is betrothed to his sworn enemy from childhood, and it just kind of follows him kind of reintegrating himself into the island society. Part of the journey is, like, on his boat ride back to the island, he was on the ship with the new governor of the island and made good friends with him. So then he gets invited to, like, dinner and the balls at the governor's mansion. He's, invited to a lot of events and to a lot of social events that other white people are invited to, but so he's kind of walking this fine line of, well, he has the education, he has the money, he has, like, the political and friend connections, but some people are still very insulted that they would have to sit at the same dinner table as him. So eventually the story goes that George kind of decides that, like, all right, there is no gaining white people's respect. We gotta burn the whole thing down. And he leads a giant slave revolt over the island. Now, what's very interesting in this book is not just the relationship between the white people and the mulatto mixed race people, but the fact that the mulattoes themselves own slaves. And the language in the book very clearly still shows this hierarchy. It's such a mindfuck, and I really enjoyed the process of reading it. I think there's a lot in here that could be interpreted as problematic, but I feel like, okay, but the book is old enough, and let's remember that Alexandre Dumas was himself not a white man. I think it's a very interesting snapshot into the world at this time and the various thoughts around race and racial hierarchy at the time. I really enjoyed the process of reading this and, like, looking at the snapshot that Alexandre Dumas chose to portray, because, George's family will talk about, like, the disrespect that they receive at the hands of white men, and then turn around and talk about being slave owners and, how happy their slaves are because they treat them so well. And of course, the slaves being, very dark-skinned Africans are not very intelligent and, need the guiding hand of their better educated mulatto masters. And it's so fascinating. I think there is this very comfortable cushion of time of, how old this book is. Let's see, when was this published? 1829, maybe? Early to mid 1800s. So I think that cushion of time allows us to, like, look at these contradictions and hypocrisies and some of this, very problematic language with, like, this shield to, like, just analyze it, and rather than necessarily be uncomfortable in the moment. That's not to say that someone else might read this and be uncomfortable reading it, and, like, that's fine. Of course, there's, like, no one way to interpret it, but, this is up there with, like, Gone with the Wind and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn in terms of, like, iconic classic literature that has these very problematic elements that were very much of their time. And, there's a whole conversation about, like, okay, but what was the author's intent versus what was them just writing from their own experience and writing from what the thought process was at the time. Anyway, I had a great time with this, weirdly. And maybe some of this might be due to the translation. This is a translation by Tina A. Kover. I found the writing very, very approachable. I think I had experienced this before with Alexandre Dumas' writing, which, again, is probably 50% due to the translator's work. But I found his writing very approachable, very engaging, very action-packed, and, not stuffy and over-flowery and drawn out like some other classic literature that I have attempted to read. So, yeah, successful reread. Next, I listened to an ebook. I listened to an audiobook of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race by, what's her name? Beverly Daniel Tatum, and she narrates the audiobook. I didn't realize that this book was already 20 years old. So it's got a very, very lengthy preface to the new edition that in the ebook at least is like a quarter of the book. So yeah, it was like 20% of the book by the time I finished with the preface. And I guess like a trigger warning about the preface, because so much about race, so many like conversations about race have been so front and center, and the language about it has been changing so much in the past like 10 years anyway. She does a lot of like going through the major events that have influenced this conversation, and at some point it kind of just felt like an overwhelming amount of like, holy shit, of talking about, you know, black men getting killed by police, black men getting killed by other civilians, things happening in schools, the election of Donald Trump, and like at some point I was listening to it being like, holy shit, this, like, it's important to remember these events, but it's hard to realize just how many traumatic events happened in so short a time, relatively. So if you pick this up, just take care with that there's the possibility of like just bad news after bad news after bad news after bad news for a while while she's summarizing like what new events have transpired since she first wrote the book. So this book, of course, talks about a lot of similar topics that books like, you know, So You Want to Talk About Race, White Fragility, just kind of like explaining what the fuck is going on. Like, why is this still such an issue? Why is racial disparity in this country still such an issue, especially with black people? And what has changed about the conversation, and like what needs to change, and really kind of examining the concept of institutional racism and implicit bias and all of those things. So I would put this book kind of in the middle of like advancedness of these kinds of books. Something like So You Want to Talk About Race is very introductory, but then something like The New Jim Crow, I would say, is like more, quote, advanced. Not necessarily that it's more difficult to read, but it's more of a narrow focus and much more data driven. And it's kind of focused on a more specific aspect of race relations in this country. And I think this one still has a bit of a broad scope, but this author, she is I believe a psychology professor. She's a very well-versed academic, and she definitely brings that. She definitely brings her professor hat to expanding on some of these issues. And, you know, what I really liked about her structure of this is she starts with childhood development. And, you know, being a mother herself, you know, she brings in anecdotes of her own life of, you know, what are the formative things that start, you know, children of color, and specifically black children in this country, how do they start forming a sense of racial identity within the context of this country? And, you know, what's up with like their psychological development at that age and how that impacts them. And then how do we start to see that reflected in like their behavior in school? You know, and she kind of circles back to this conversation of like, why do all the black kids sit together? You know, and she goes into talking about like adolescence and like the unique aspect of adolescent and puberty, self-identity, and how much like the need to have a peer group of people who understand the unique things that you're going through, you know, how that really starts to crystallize, and then, you know, what happens to somebody like at a university level. What I like about her writing is, while I do see her academic influence in terms of research and studies and data and psychology terms and brain development and things, she doesn't use academic jargon. If she does need to use like a specific term to summarize a lengthy paragraph explanation, she does a really good job of like explaining that term in isolation very clearly and then going on to use it, rather than just throwing a shit ton of jargon at you over and over again in the way that sometimes happens in like really academic research papers. So I really like her writing. I thought her presentation of ideas is very clear, and she definitely builds on ideas that she lays the groundwork for in previous chapters. Yeah, especially like I think the unique thing in this book is, you know, her talking about childhood development, adolescent development, because a lot of these conversations are about adults who are choosing to interact with these ideas and choosing to try to have these conversations, or are not choosing to have these conversations but are faced with them anyway and have to navigate them anyway. And I found that like her perspective of like how to have these like how to talk about race with a 5-year-old, and giving examples from her own life. Like, it's not just valuable to other parents of color, but also for white parents to see that this stuff is important for children at that age. You know, if you're old enough to experience racism, you're old enough to talk about it. And also, like, to see, like, these are the kind of conversations that parents of color have to have with their children. And that can be very informative of how you as a you know, anti-racist parent can try to also start to educate your children to be sensitive to these issues, and also understanding that like children asking uncomfortable, awkward questions comes with the territory. One of my favorite moments is like when kids ask uncomfortable questions, like if they see like a child in a grocery store with if someone sees like a black mother with like a much lighter skinned child, you know, your child might ask like, why don't they match? Which is just like, you know, if that's the first time you've ever really seen that, that's a very valid question. And you know, this author, she talks about there's a lot of instinct of like, that's an awkward question, I don't want the other person to hear me, and you just respond with shush. And what that teaches your child is that's not an okay thing to talk about. Rather than figuring out how to prepare yourself to actually deal with those questions. Even if your answer is, I don't really know. But to teach your child from an early age that race itself is not an uncomfortable thing to acknowledge, to look at, to be curious about, and to want to learn more about. So yeah, I found that very valuable. It's a pretty lengthy book, especially with that new preface, but yeah, it's a worthy read. I guess that one was not charged long enough. We're going back to the old clip lights. Hopefully, this other one doesn't crap out on me too soon. Next, we have All Systems Red by Martha Wells, the first little novella in the Murderbot Diaries. Yes, this was fun. This is about a security droid who has gained sentience and autonomy, and is very socially awkward and doesn't want to deal with people and doesn't want to be violent, and just wants to watch like reruns of like soap operas all day. And this is kind of about the journey of, feels like a television episode of like, you're introduced to this character and their research team, and something happens to the research team, and they, you know, and Murderbot decides, it's like, you know what, I might be super awkward, but I kind of like you guys, and you are in danger, and I'm gonna try and help you, and I'm kind of need to keep a secret that I have disabled, like, my security protocols, and just kind of, like, navigating that whole scenario. It was a fun time. I totally see the hype. I totally plan to continue with the series. Fun. Fun, fun. Next, I picked up a copy of Dick Fight Island by Reibun Ike. Ike? I've seen a couple of people pick this up. I think the first person I saw pick it up was Angel from Jurassic Reads. So this is a, boy love manga that takes place on this fantastical island where every couple of years the men compete. So they compete over who is like the strongest person, and then the person who wins gets to be king of this island region. And the way they compete is whoever comes first loses. So they developed this very extravagant armor and various fighting techniques to battle in that manner. So while this is very explicit, it's also very silly and very cute. And of course, some of the competitors kind of like grew up together and they have feelings for each other. Or some of them have like previous rivalries that come to bear. But yeah, I was curious. My library didn't have it. Couldn't find a used copy. I finally was in a bookstore that specializes in manga and Asian fiction. I don't know if I will continue with the series. It's like a little bit too... like, for how explicit it is, it's also very, like, twee. Just very, like, cutesy. It's funny how it's both. It was interesting to read. It was still a good time, and my curiosity is satisfied. Next, I read Autonomous by Annalee Newitz. This is fantastic. I love this so much. I'm going to read the synopses because I will not be able to explain it concisely. And I need to finish this up so we can go get dinner. So Earth 2144, Jack is an anti-patent scientist turned drug pirate, traversing the world in a submarine as a pharmaceutical Robin Hood, fabricating cheap scripts for poor people who can't otherwise afford them. But her latest drug hack has left a trail of lethal overdoses as people become addicted to their work, doing repetitive tasks until they become unsafe or insane. Hot on her trail, an unlikely pair, Elias, a brooding military agent, and his robotic partner Paladin. As they race to stop information about the sinister origins of Jack's drug from getting out, they begin to form an uncommonly close bond that neither of them fully understand. And underlying it all is one fundamental question: is freedom even possible in a culture where everything, even people, can be owned? So elaborating on Jack's storyline, so she occasionally has to, she definitely wants to reverse gen engineer like antivirals and cancer treating drugs and things like that to give to people, but sometimes doing like party drugs or like productivity drugs are, she doesn't really like that they're out there in the world, but she knows that there's a demand for them and those are the things that pay the bills. So that's why fabricates this thing in the first place. But the reason that it's deadly is not her fault. She copied it perfectly. So that's part of her trial, is like she knows that she's a dead woman walking, like this giant corporation, has basically sent an assassin after her. But she's trying to find people to help her to figure out an antidote and like try to fix her problem as best she can, but also like do the research and have the evidence to prove that she's not the one who made it dangerous. She just expanded people's access to it. But, there are things about this drug that were illegal before she even touched it. Yeah. So if you want anti-capitalist, cyberpunkish fiction, ta-da. I mean, I say cyberpunk, but like it's not even really about like networking anymore. But like one of the blurbs on here is autonomous is to biotech and AI what Neuromancer was to the internet. So it is kind of still in that cyberpunk kind of vein, but it's not cyber anymore, it's biotech. But yeah, it really looks at this possible future of, pharmaceutical corporations owning patents. Actually, hold on, what was that? You know, this is an excerpt from someone's essay that is kind of from a newspaper that is pro like drug piracy, because like what the corporations are doing is fucking unethical to begin with. It was popular for conservatives to claim that putting Gen egg into the hands of the public would result in megaviruses or total species collapse. Open data would be the gateway to a runaway synthetic biology apocalypse. But now we know there has been no one great disaster, only the slow motion disaster of capitalism converting every living thing and idea into property. It's fantastic. I need to read more from this author. I like her ideas. I like what her brain's coming up with. Okay. Next up, I finished an arc of Song of Silver, Flame Like Night. This is a book that's going to be released. It's being released like January 3rd. This, I believe, is a young adult fantasy that draws on Chinese mythology. And y'all, it's fantastic. I started reading this and I was like, oh shit, yeah, this is the caliber of young adult fantasy that I want in my life. I was like immediately comparing it to Keeper of Night, which is like an Asian inspired fantasy that I read recently, and I'm realizing like how just fine that one is compared to this one. So you can definitely see how much passion and personal history the author has poured into this work. So this is kind of a wuxia inspired literary arc. It follows a young girl who so she's living in China, and China has been colonized by the Atlanteans, basically colonized by white people who are, you know, so she's living under subjugated colonial rule. You know, she's being forced to speak the colonizers' language. You know, she has to work in a tea house to cater to them. You know, it's a lot of living under occupation and the abuses and power imbalances of their circumstances. And this book definitely pulls no punches in depicting how utterly degrading and humiliating it is to live under those circumstances. The Atlanteans have a special form of magic that draws from metal power, and one of these metal sorcerers actually killed her mother when she was young. And her mother's last act was to impart this symbol on her wrist that only she can see to her knowledge, and imparts some kind of mythical destiny onto her. But she doesn't really know what it is. She just knows, she's kind of searching through like black market booksellers and stuff to try to research this symbol, because she doesn't know what it is and nobody else can see it. Until she meets another young Chinese man who can see the symbol and actually works magic by drawing those symbols in the air. And it's a magic that is drawn from qi, which is the life energy that is present in all living things. And, you know, so they go off, you know, they gain the attention of one of the Atlantean mages who wants to capture them and learn more about their magic to use for his own devices. So she goes off and runs off with this guy, and she's like, I don't know you. You know more about this than you're letting on. I don't want to trust you, but you are the first clue to my life that I have ever encountered. So it's kind of this push-pull of like them definitely having misgivings about the other person. They've both kind of grown up to be mistrustful, understandably so. But they're also very curious to each other and eventually very drawn to each other in other ways. I liked how that relationship was built up. It was not insta-love, especially by the end. It's like you definitely, it makes the ending more heartbreaking because like the build-up is, it's well done. The author definitely earns your investment in what they find in each other, like finally finding someone who understands what you're going through, understands your history, understands why your destiny is so personally important. But each of them have a different take on what the solution is going to be, and that is where the paths diverge and where like the rest of the story kicks off. Yeah, so the magic system is very interesting. I was thankful. I don't think it's like the most straightforward kind of magic, but I kind of had like a groundwork laid for it because I read the Legends of the Condor series, which is like the most famous Chinese one of the most famous Chinese fantasy series. It's like from the 50s. But like understanding the way that they use chi energy, the way that there's like life-giving chi, and then like the chi that comes from death and darkness, and how everything needs to be in balance. You know, it's less about something being good or evil and more about how do you use it in balance with other things. And how much these, you know, teenage maybe like early 20-something kids really struggle with that, and they like how the book really struggles with in order to free themselves from the Atlanteans' rule, they're going to need access to power equal or greater to the magic that the Atlanteans are using, but the only way to get that power is to risk being tempted and consumed by it. And you know, it's definitely playing with the old adage of like, you know, infinite power corrupts, or like absolute power corrupts absolutely. But when you go your whole life as being someone without power, you also know like the value of having power at all. And like how impossible it can seem to reach your goals without drastic measures. It's very well done. I'm very excited for this author. I don't think it's her debut, but this is definitely like a true passion project for her, and I greatly look forward to the next installment in the series whenever it comes out. But yeah, if this has been on your radar, I highly recommend it. It's great. So the next book I picked up was Young Warrior Stories of Strength. This is a collection of short stories that's edited by Tamora Pierce and Josepha Sherman. So I initially picked this up because I was trying to be a completionist with Tamora Pierce's works, and I thought this was a collection of her short stories. It's not. She does have one story in here, but it's mostly stories by other people, including Holly Black, and let's see, who else do I recognize in here? S.M. Sterling and Brent Hartinger. Anyway, there's a couple of established fantasy writers in here. This was fine. There were some stories that I thought were really interesting and very inventive, and there were some where I was like, I almost don't want to finish it, but it's only like 5 pages. I might as well. But the thing that really took up my brain in this is, let's see, this collection came out in 2005, and most of these stories look like they were written for this collection in 2005. So that's, hey, it's 2023 now. I gotta redo all that math. This was like 18 years ago, 17, 18 years ago now. So we have a lot of conversations about like diversity representation and like own voices and things like that. I was impressed with the amount of diversity in the stories, of having fantasy featuring like non-white characters and featuring like European Western centric fantasy systems and fantasy worlds. Like there's things that were very clearly influenced by like Asian and like Russian Slavic and African and Middle Eastern, and I think there was one that was like Australian Aborigine inspired. Points for that, but do you know what I'm gonna say? From what I could tell, all of these authors are white or white passing. So I feel weird about it. You know, I want to be gracious and say I'm sure the motivation was they wanted to see more diversity in storytelling, and they were going to make it happen themselves. And they were, this was their step to make it happen. But, I have the question of like, okay, but what effort was made to include authors of color in this collection? Like, I don't know, yes, this is something that was edited by Tamora Pierce and Josepha Sherman, but, like, was it their idea to begin with? Was it, like, their editor's idea, and, like, the editor was inviting people to be part of this collection? Like, I have questions about that process and what led to a book with a lot of diverse stories, but not really diverse authors. So I feel weird about it. Just leave that there. Okay, and then the last book I finished, I listened to an audio arc of Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfit, and this is narrated by Nicky Endres. So this book, I believe, had already been out in the UK for a while, because I remember seeing Books and Bow do a review of this months ago, and they raved about it. And of course, their reviews are always very, very well done, very thorough, and yeah, and I was kind of on the fence about how, if I wanted to read it, because it is a horror, and yep, it's definitely a horror. Definitely a very uncomfortable horror book that deals with transness and fascism and, turf violence and a lot of sexual violence. But I kept hearing, like, other people pick it up. Arc came available on NetGalley. I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna see. I'm gonna see, because it's NetGalley. It's 50-50. Not even. It's like 80-20 whether or not I'm actually gonna get approved for it, and I did. And I'm glad I went with the audio arc, because I would definitely say the audio is the way to go. So anyway, this was fucking excellent, but lots of trigger warnings. So this book follows two main characters, a young trans woman and her ex-lover, ex-best friend, whose name I do remember is Illa. Illa is a cis woman, and they had an experience where they went into this abandoned house with a third girl, Hannah. Hannah never made it out of the house, and each of them have the distinct memory, including physical scars, as evidence that, the other one sexually assaulted them. So, not only are they dealing with the aftermath of being very violently and surreally sexually assaulted, but having the other person say, no, that's what you did to me. And having to deal with that extra layer of mindfuck. So Illa, as a consequence of her trauma, has become a fascist, anti-trans activist. She's going to TERF meetings, she's giving interviews, she's very much kind of using her sexual trauma as the opening up point of, trans women are not women, they are men trying to hide how dangerous they are by wearing the guise of women. Very, very relevant, very scary and disgusting and inaccurate rhetoric. So that's what's happening with Illa, and the other girl, I need to look up her name. It's not fair that I remember one and not the other. Alice. Her name is Alice. So, Alice is dealing with a very specific haunting. She's got, like, this stain on her wall that she's trying to cover up with a poster, and she has these nightmares where, like, the like guy in the band poster that she's covered it with comes to life, and like she's definitely being not just haunted by the memory of what happened to her, but there is this energy, there is this something that has latched onto her and is definitely haunting her. Anyway, so they're both struggling in their own ways. And what's interesting to this is definitely a very interesting take on the haunted house aspect, because like the haunted house is kind of in itself a character, and it's kind of infested with with like fascism as kind of like its own malevolent presence, its own malevolent entity of itself, and fascism kind of has its own intentions and its own desire, and it's this poison that's like seeping into the country, and the house, because of its particular history, is kind of a wellspring for it, and that's a very interesting conversations, because periodically we go to the perspective of like the ways fascism is like manifesting itself in the world, or like bits of the history of the house, and we kind of get things from the house's perspective. So it's got a little bit of like In the Dream House vibes, where like the house itself is a character. So I mentioned like, yeah, we talk a lot about like sexual violence, and like anti-trans rhetoric. Alice is also dealing with kind of spiraling into like anti-trans sexual fetishes, as kind of a way of like exploring her own trauma. You know, this is where I think the audiobook is really the way to go, because like while it's really hard to listen to like some of those segments, it also really illustrates, it really, you know, the performance of it really illustrates the like hypnotism and this kind of propaganda, this kind of brainwashing can be very like hypnotic, how this very like degrading kinky sexual language has like this hypnotic trance like element. That's kind of like what one of the kink facets is, but it's kind of mirroring like extremist language and fascist language like in our social media and in our news. And it's like, yeah, if you start hearing it over and over and over and over again from all fucking sides, those thoughts kind of start just living in your head, and you might not even agree with them at first, but they start popping up in your mind without you even going looking for it. That's kind of like how the seed is planted, is that idea just becomes so common. Yeah, and I think the author does a great job of like using that to illustrate this like psychotic nightmare that is dealing with the aftermath of this event. Oh, and I should also say, plot-wise, eventually Illa contacts Alice and is kind of like at her wit's end and is like, we need to go back to the house. Because again, I mentioned, hey, the third girl, Hannah, never made it out of the house. So they both know that something fucking weird happened there. They know that there's unresolved stuff, and they finally choose to go back to the house and just finish whatever the fuck is going on. And find out what, you know, try to get some kind of closure, whatever version it manifests itself in. I will say, like, at the very, very end, well, again, this is very intentional, like, surreal, nightmare, hallucinogenic horror things happening. I felt like at the end it went on a bit too long, and even, like, the narrator's voice talent couldn't quite save it, because by the end I was kind of like, are we done yet? Like, I understand what's going on, things are completely unraveled, I understand. So that's, you know, probably knocked off like half a star for me, just because there were, like, that moment in particular, I was really like, this is too long, really ready for this to be over. But overall I still think it's really well done, very thought-provoking, very uncomfortable in a very intentional and purposeful way. So if it's on your radar and you think you can handle the content, I recommend it. But I also give you permission to say, nope, that doesn't sound like a good time at all. Yeah, I definitely wouldn't describe it as a good time, but like the thought project was interesting. and very timely and very well executed. That's it. Those are the books. Sorry for the quirky lighting setup. I was kind of wondering how long the battery would last on my new filming lights, and apparently, all right, I need to make sure they are freshly charged at the top of each video. So I think they maybe run like 2 hours when they're fully charged. So now I know that. Cool. All right. I hope you have a good rest of your day. I encourage you to go out into the world and be curious. I will have my social media and other places where you can find me in the description box below. Oh, I will also have information about the HarperCollins strike, because as of the day that I'm filming this, which is January 1st, I believe the strike is still going on. So I will leave the information that has information about the strike and what the workers are asking for and ways that you can help. I will have all of that in my description box. And I will catch you folks in my next video. Bye!